Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We are so glad that you could join us today for our session, Beyond Collaborations, the Process and Possibilities of a Nonprofit Merger. This is the first of the Beyond Collaboration series where we will discuss various ways that nonprofits can come together to continue making an impact. My name is Sandeep, and I'm the Manager of Education here at IntegralOrg. I'll be hosting today's session, so you can reach me in the chat at any time. We will begin today's session with a land acknowledgement. As we gather today, we acknowledge that what we now call the province of Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territory of many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. This land has been known as Alberta for just over 100 years. From the peaks of the Rockies to rolling foothills, from the expanse of boreal forests to stretches of southern prairies, this land is as diverse as the people and stories within it. As we learn more historical truths, we recognize with gratitude the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who have kept and passed on these stories. IntegralOrg recognizes the existing tension between the legal and governance structures that we work within and efforts towards truth and reconciliation. We accept our responsibility to work towards reconciling this tension. As we gather in this place, we all have a connection and responsibility to the lands that host our lives, our communities, and our work. Okay, with that, I would like to introduce our facilitators for today. I would like to welcome Mike Rogan, IntegralOrg President and CEO, who has worked in the nonprofit sector for over 25 years and is recognized for his ability to inspire nonprofit organizations to tackle complex issues and create sustainable solutions. Mike is joined by Leslie Tamagi. Leslie is the principal of Leslie Tamagi Leadership Solutions and has more than 25 years of experience as CEO of diverse organizations and has worked with nonprofit organizations providing training and supporting them through their risk management journeys. Mike and Leslie are joined by Ryan Geake, CEO of Calgary Scope Society, who has been with the organization for over 30 years, previously teaching in the social work faculty at the University of Calgary, focusing on community development and lobbying. With that, I will pass it over to Mike to get us going for today's session.
Thank you, Sandeep, and thank you all. It is a privilege and a pleasure to have you with us today. I can see some of your faces, some folks that I have known for quite some time, so fantastic that you're here. And just thank you for joining us. This is really, a big area of work for IntegralOrg, but I think more importantly, it's maybe an opportunity or a shift or a dynamic in the sector that pops up from now and then, but I think we're seeing growing in more importance. So today we want to talk a little bit about, not about mergers. I know the title is about mergers, we'll get to that, but sort of talk about this thing called strategic alliances and put some frame around it. So it's a bit more understanding of the whole context of the options available to you. Some of the initial definitional pieces, what those things might mean, but also then just, how you get started and some basic things. So a giant topic, we certainly won't do it, justice in terms of getting into a lot of depth, but we'll spend a lot of time just hearing from Ryan and the journey that Scope has been on with Care Human Services in Grand Prairie, and they're coming together, which is still in process, but certainly well underway. But the things you see on the surface and what you see publicly sometimes certainly don't tell the story of this. So for Ryan to sort of share his journey, their thoughts, what drove them there, what surprised them, will be the bulk of our time today. But also lots of room for your questions. So as you're talking, as we're working through this stuff, as you're thinking about this stuff, a question pops mind, throw it in the chat. We'll try and get to the end. Certainly afterwards, if you got things to say, do reach out, because that's what we're here for. To start with, though, just to recognize that we are, what you're going to hear today is, this is information and insight. So part of the work we do at IntegralOrg is in the regulatory world, and we are a legal service provider. So we're going to tell you, this is not legal information. So there we go. So use it as to inform yourself, use it to sort of ask questions. But if you're needing some more deep advice, there's lots of lawyers out there. We run free clinics with our legal counsel if you want to talk about it. Lots of ways to learn. But make sure your learning is informed, because there's lots of things that can go very well here. There's a lot more things that can go wrong. So as you go forward here, let's try and avoid those pitfalls. So I want to start with the idea when we talk about mergers are a very specific type of sort of what we would call a strategic alliance. And it's probably not fair to start with that. But that is what a lot of people sort of come to. When we talk about organizations coming together, mergers is kind of the upper range of how that might look. But mergers, even within that world, what we would call a corporate integration, I'll walk through all these things for you here in a few minutes, is a very specific type of coming together. So I want to say that, you don't start with merger. We don't start with, I'm going to come together or join another organization. We come together with, what do we want to do? We talk about what do we want to do? What is the difference we want to make in the world? And are we better together? And is that something that's, helped by a merger, a partnership, a collaboration, lots of ways to do that. So you don't start with the mechanism in mind. You start with what do we want to do and where do we want to go with things? So when we start to talk about the why, and there's a lot of reasons as to why. So there's a few, and you could sort of spend a day saying every situation that you see in terms of what ends up as a merger or a partnership or a collaboration has a different root. But to understand those, okay, why am I really in it? And that's where it gets a little trickier at some points because the why has to match up somehow. This is no longer a singular game. This is you in a relationship. And so those relationship things, as we all know, you got to sort of start with, why are we both here? What are we going to do? We do see some common themes to this, though. As I say, I remember start of COVID, early days 2020, there's a sort of meeting of folks in this world and saying, we're going to see a lot more mergers. And we didn't. We didn't see a lot of mergers. The Trellis one was announced then, but I think that was probably pre-COVID, perhaps. A lot of the work for that anyway. But, and then things went kind of quiet. And but over the last 18 months or so, certainly at IntegralOrg, this has probably become one of the largest parts of our work. It does fit our legal strategy and governance work that we do. It fits as well. I think it's probably been half a dozen that we've been involved with. Not all of them move to a merger. Some of them go to different places of work. But I think we're seeing perhaps some of those cracks that were in the sector before that are starting to manifest itself in different ways of understanding what we want to do. And the why question comes back all the time. So sometimes you get people coming down this path or heading down a path this way and saying that they question the survival, perhaps, or sustainability of the organization. You may get sometimes when an organization really is in trouble and can't survive and needs somebody to take them over. That's usually a little more straightforward. It's pretty clear cut. You're not necessarily dealing with equals in that sense. But sometimes we're getting questions about, today we're okay, but I don't know, 5 years out, the environment we're in, funding, regulatory, government policy, service delivery needs, human resources, I'm not sure that 5 years out, this model works. And is there a possibility if I join with somebody else that might be an option? So that idea of, what do we need to do to sort of think about not just the present reality, but the future reality as well is really important and sometimes in the mix. Sometimes there's an opportunity out there that you just can't do alone. Sometimes you think there's a funding application or something out there and a community need, a building project, and say, we need to be at scale or have a different skill set or have different range of options or different geographic range that may allow for that possibility of coming together in a different way. And other times it's an internal and external dynamic that changes. Maybe a funding thing has changed. Maybe a lot of times what we see is somewhere, and not always, but quite commonly, there is a change in the leadership position in one organization. Sometimes board, quite often CEO or executive director coming up or have just happened. And that's driving a lot of these things. And that does take one of the considerations off the table. If you're going down that path of a full merger and you're looking across the table at somebody and say it's you or me, that's a different dynamic. If one of those places is vacant or soon to become vacant or has become vacant or what has been in the past, perhaps that's off the table. So some of those internal dynamics on the staffing side, the human resource side, maybe programmatically, sometimes external where you have different geographic things happening, lots of whys. So it doesn't have to start anywhere. It starts with that question. It starts with saying, are we better together? When we talk about mergers, we don't start with mergers. We talk with this thing called a strategic alliance continuum. And this is based on work by LaPiana out of the States, David LaPiana. And I'm very good in this kind of work. And they start with this range from the very far side where you're very autonomous to that's on the left side, I guess. And then the right side where you're actually integrated. And they can work across these things. And you may start in one place and end up in another. If you start on the right side, it's kind of more permanent, and I'll unpack each of these things. But to know you don't necessarily start with one way of doing things, you start with the why, and then what's the format to get you there, and perhaps stage these things. So the very far right of the thing, we have these collaborations. Certainly nonprofits, we're good at this. There's lots of collaboration, lots of expectation of collaboration. either really light collaboration where we kind of work with people in a somewhat informal way to a little more defined way. But at this end of the spectrum, there's no permanent commitment. We're not changing organizational structures. You're still running your own ship. The organizations don't change in some ways. You might come together to do some work together in a very limited place, a program perhaps, maybe a fundraising campaign, maybe a shared facility that's a little maybe on the middle of the spectrum here, things like that. No permanent commitment, and decision-making power is retained. And decision-making power is one of the things that is a key driver on this. When you start to change decision-making power, you're changing corporate structures, and that's where it gets more complex. So this is great if you're trying to pool expertise, maybe amplify a policy message, create and share some wisdom, or maybe tackle some social issues with coordinated action. Lots of stuff we see in the nonprofit world. I'd say very commonplace. Whether or not it's under a formal or semi-formal agreement, that's to be determined. As we sort of move towards the middle, we think, well, perhaps that's not enough. Maybe we need a little more longer term commitment. We get this sort of bucket of work called strategic alliances or formal alliances, sorry. And this is longer term. It's committing for the foreseeable future, perhaps. You're walking into something that is perhaps a little more structured, a lot more structured. This is where you have things like memorandums of agreements or binding commitments. But still, you haven't shared, you're still autonomous organizations. You are still saying we run our own show. We still have 2 boards, 2 incorporation statuses, 2 charitable statuses, whatever it might be. But we're locking into a longer term project. So maybe that's shared funding, maybe that's integrating programmatic work. We're saying our clients need your services as well as much your clients need ours. And for the foreseeable future, we'll interlock those things. Sometimes you'll see it on back office support saying, we're going to ship all of our accounting stuff to your organization. You got capacity, but I'm making a long-term commitment. We're still in charge of our own show. We haven't changed decision-making, but for the foreseeable future, we are moving forward in a much more integrated fashion. It's also a place if we're starting to think, well, maybe in the long term, we are going to bring the organizations together in some sort of amalgamation or integration. We can sort of try it out a bit and say, okay, let's try some of these things for a while in a really structured, really well-designed, really formal way before we take sort of the whole meal deal and get married at the end. So some organizational efficiency pieces here, perhaps, maybe providing shared programs or services on an ongoing basis, maybe more in depth, perhaps sharing the benefits and the risks. Sometimes just having this sort of partner with you along the way, absorb some of the risks for the work you're doing in ways you can't do it alone or isn't wise for you to do it alone. And sometimes just leveraging sort of advocacy and power and those sort of things on an ongoing basis. At the top end of the continuum, or the very fight for our right end, is where we're starting to change corporate structures. And we talk about getting legal advice. This is where you need to be really quite careful. We'll walk through some of the definitional pieces, but there are some confusing pieces here. This is where we're making permanent decisions. Go back for a second, Sandeep. We're making some permanent changes to structure. So when we say that some of these things don't lock you in, you get to this range and you're fully committed, this is where you're locked in. Lots of off-ramps along the way, so you don't start here, but this is where we're talking about things where corporate control changes. So your board structure, the DNA of the organization. We sort of see 3 areas of work. There's a lot of people talk about mergers. I'm going to break all these down in a second here. But there are different ways of doing it. A merger, an amalgamation, a consolidation. Lots of confusion there. They're not all the same, and not every jurisdiction calls in the same way. The bottom line is, though, these tend to be more permanent, and they are permanent, basically. And you change their corporate structure. So these are the things we're thinking about. If you really want to make that big change, go ahead, Sandeep. To what we're doing, this is where you're making the change forever. So it's permanent. You're combining skills, resources, human resources, financing, facilities, all those kind of things. You're consolidating everything into one. So this is when you really do think this one through. These do not happen overnight. You're talking months, if not years of work sometimes to get to this place. Really well informed. You want to do some things along the way, which we'll break down. Just to give you a couple thoughts on definitional pieces here too. It is confusing as to what is what. So we start with IntegralOrg. If you're a charity, which a lot of folks in this call are, I know, is one of our guiding principles of IntegralOrg is do no harm to your charitable status. There's things that you can tune up and do along the way. Don't mess around with charitable status. So we start with CRA quite often. So if you're a charity, you think of what does CRA talk about charities? And so CRA does recognize that the definitions they use for what an amalgamation, a consolidation, or a merger is may differ than some in other jurisdictions, such as Alberta. So there are some differences between the corporate legislation, what you're incorporated under, and the Income Tax Act, which sort of drives our charitable status. This is why you probably need to get some guidance on this thing, so we don't want to do any harm to your charitable status. So there are some things that CRA gives us. So they give us 3 definitions of what they believe to be, they see these things as. They see an amalgamation, a merger, and a consolidation. I'll give you a little graphic on each one because I think visually, so you should too, apparently. So an amalgamation is, where 2 or more organizations, I'll leave it about for a second, I'm going to read for a second before we get visual here. 2 or more organizations come together. And so you don't wind any of them down. They kind of coexist in sort of working along the same pathway together here. So you're not creating a new entity, you're not winding down an entity, you're seeing 2 organizations that continue on. They may look like one of the entities, but the other one's still there. I think Canadian mental health and suicide prevention is an example of an amalgamation that just is going through or has just been voted on the last few months here. A merger is where one organization winds up its affairs and transfers assets and everything to another organization. There's no new entity creator, but one does go away. When we hear about scope and care, that is the premise of that relationship, that eventually scope will be here and care will go away, which is a really hard decision to make. If you've invested your life into an organization, there is some grieving there, and that's part of the process to honor those human emotions. Consolidation is the third thing. It is where we've got 2 organizations, perhaps. We're going to create a third one, a new one, and pour all the assets, people, contracts, work into that new organization. We create something new. Sometimes that's the best way to go because of legislative kind of things. You can't actually bring folks together. Sometimes it's better to go that way because you got 2 strong brands. You don't want to favor either one of them. Sometimes there's other reasons. So you have this 3 different options, and now we'll do the visuals to sort of make it really clear, I hope. So an amalgamation, you've got agency A, B, they come together, neither one goes away. You move forward in this combined kind of way. You have the second option of the merger, which is you have agencies A and B. A is in this case going to stick around. They're going to absorb all the assets and the people and all the contracts from B, and B will eventually be wound down and go away, which will take some time because those are things that transfer and that kind of getting to that place on a regulatory piece is going to take you a couple of years perhaps. And the last option is this consolidation. You have agency A, agency B, and you come together and you create something new. And all the stuff goes into the agency C, B, and then you wind down both A and B. So again, lots of options here. It depends on your circumstances. Again, get some guidance on this because if you mess this one up, you may not get too far down the path should CRA not be approving of what you'll do. So a couple of things, just when you think about this, there are ways to walk through this. You don't start with a big bite. If you're wanting to do some sort of collaboration or work on a sort of shorter term way, getting to know each other, test some things out, or do work that probably is time bound, maybe not quite as in depth, you're probably in some sort of collaboration. You get to a little more formal in this and you want to say, I want to do this for a little longer period of time. It's got more depth. I need to put more resources into it, perhaps make a deeper commitment. You're into some sort of joint programming, administrative consolidation, we call a formal alliance. And it does cost you. There are costs to all these things. So you may have to give some things up along the way in both these things. And again, saying, we want to go a little further. We want to get bigger. We want to do more work, get expanse out, what it might be. We're probably into some sort of corporate integration. I'm not going to give you a ton of stuff on where you start, but I think the idea that you got to do this thing planfully. And this is a great quote. Last couple of years ago, maybe 4 years ago now, I guess. Miller Thompson, great law firm, Wootart Foundation put a guidebook out on mergers for the nonprofit sector. Really good. It's Canadian, which is good. If you're looking for material, Canadian material is better than not. It's pretty modern. It's pretty clear in their language. But planning your future is always better than having your future overtake you. And that's when I talked about the first sort of driver of this stuff, saying that perhaps you don't want to be in such a place where you're so desperate financially, you're being basically taken over, to do this intentionally and to take away some of the stigma of this, to say, it's no failure to wind something down. There should be a celebration of this and say a better way of doing work, maybe to do this one of these types of alliances. The idea of putting your purpose before your organization is a sort of construct of governance we sometimes throw into the mix here. So a few things you want to think about before you start doing this stuff. Why you want to do this again, what's going to come out of this relationship, what do you want to hope to accomplish? And to probably have that really clear in your head, usually a lot of these things start with a conversation between 2 CEOs, maybe a couple board members, but what's the why? What do you want to do? And that likely will sort of evolve over time. As you start peeling back the layers and getting more involved in these things, the why might shift a bit, but to say, why do we want to do this? And at first, that's just where you start with. The idea of, do you have the capacity to do this work? If the lighter end of the spectrum, perhaps on collaboration, that's not going to cost you a ton. You get back to the sort of full meal corporate integration, It is a major piece, and it's not done overnight. It does take time. It's going to take time from senior staff, probably some support folks. It's going to take the governance piece to be in there as well. So it's something that's not side of the desk work to do it well. And just my last thought is that all this begins in a conversation. You know, that you can have conversations, and those conversations perhaps need to be done under conditions where there's some sense of confidentiality. Sometimes that's great, sometimes that's perhaps overblown, but you know, what do you want to do? Who do you have that conversation with? And to say, what are the possibilities? What might we do better together? I'll leave you with a quote here. Oh, just the idea of due diligence. We'll talk about that a little bit throughout that. I think Ryan will give some examples of what they might have done to learn. But the idea of due diligence is making sure you're making an informed decision. You know, the idea that everybody from the staff, the board, whoever's making that decision, it's ultimately the boards that will make decisions on this stuff, that they actually have enough information. Sometimes we just think this is fiduciary sort of financial stuff. We never start with that. We start with culture a lot of times. We'll start with the why you're doing this. We'll start with the people. And that is, we'll get to finances and facilities and structures. But that due diligence is a whole bunch of pieces, from governance to regulatory to marketing to people, all programs, all kinds of stuff. But you start with that idea, how do we make an informed decision? And this is the quote that we use quite often, is just that, you know, the two best things that any participant at any level can bring to the process of merging or creating any alliance is a high tolerance for ambiguity and a sense of humor. Sense of humor is optional. I don't think so, but still. The process is intrinsically confusing, often misleading, complex, and nonlinear. That where you think you're going to be, and it takes twists and turns, there's landmines. Every time that Leslie and I and the team have done these things, you think, well, I didn't see that coming. So, and that's part of it too. And this doesn't mean they're fatal. Sometimes you regroup, sometimes not. There's never necessarily a wrong decision, but the idea that you probably don't know how to map it out from A to B to C all the way along. So with that, I'll turn it over to the folks who are going to walk you through a conversation, to Leslie and Ryan, to hear more about scope and the work they're doing with CARE. And we'll go from there. As you're listening to them, though, we'll turn the PowerPoint off. If you got questions, do fire them into the chat. I've got a few to throw out there. And at the end, there's some time for questions. So folks, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike. First of all, Ryan, I just wanted to say congratulations to you and your organization for taking this very big step. I think it takes a lot of courage to dream big and to be open to possibilities and to actually follow it through to implementation. So no small undertaking. And I know it's been a process, and we're going to talk a little bit about how that's all come about. But first of all, I just wanted to maybe just provide a bit of background and context for the folks on the call here. Can you just tell folks a little bit about, you know, who Scope is? You're a large service provider, but you have a pretty unique niche. So we'll start with Scope, and then I'll have you give maybe a little bit of information about CARE, and so people get a sense of the two organizations.
Yeah, sure, because that really goes together. But yeah, we work in the PDD disability world. Mostly our focus has been, and we started this way almost 40 years ago, to figure out ways to support folks that are considered to be duly diagnosed, so a developmental disability and accompanying mental health diagnosis. And so that's really been our work and our lane for a long time, is just that work with those folks that end up in a lot of other systems, justice and health and psychiatry, and trying to provide those community access opportunities so they can live, you know, as citizens, as ordinary as they can, with the kinds of the complexities they have.
And just in terms of size, like, can you give us a sense of Scope's number of staff?
Yeah, I think
budget? How big are you?
Yeah, I mean, our annual budget's, I think, $32 million. So I think we have like 450 staff and lots of clients. We probably have less clients in many ways than that budget sounds like, just because some of our folks are really complex, and some of them have up to 3-to-1 staff 24 hours a day. So that we have a larger staff group than we actually have a client group.
Right.
And then we do a variety of other things, but it's mostly in that kind of complex client world. So, yeah.
And primarily Calgary surrounding areas. I know you have some things going on in,
yeah, we've stayed in the region. We have a little project in Diamond Valley, and, you know, done some work just around, but yeah, it's really been in the Calgary area.
And you're a nonprofit society and a charity, correct?
That's right. Yeah. So have a great board. I think we were incorporated in 1983. Our first services were in 1985. So yeah, been a while for us, for sure.
And CARE, can you just tell us a little bit about CARE, the size of the agency, their situation geographically, they're different.
Yeah, so CARE's in Grand Prairie. I mean, the whole reason that we ended up playing is that CARE used to have a whole variety of services, also in the kind of PDD world, but they worked lots with children. They did lots of respite care. They did a lot of things. But the CEO of CARE, we were on a provincial committee together. I think Andrea and Nalim are here through ACDS. So, had a chance to spend lots of time together. And they began to move into the more complex client support area, and so found themselves in Grand Prairie without the kind of psychiatric supports that we had, the psychological behavioral psych supports that we had, just those opportunities for that additional help that you need to support these complex guys. And so they were kind of moving into that lane of complex needs. I would say the thing about their CEO, which I've really always admired, is just that ability to look at trends and see where things are going. And so she really saw a place for, there's more and more complex folks in our system. We need those services. And so really tried to bring those and play with those in the Grand Prairie region, but found that they were just getting in. Trouble is not the right word, but they were having some hard time getting, appropriate psychiatric care, appropriate behavioral supports, just really that ability to support these folks. And so those are the conversations that her and I were having at a regular, pretty regularly at our provincial meetings. And so she just said, we're in a bit of trouble here. Like, how can you help? Because we want to stay in this lane, and we believe this is the future for supports in this area, but we're not sure we can do it anymore. And so those are the kind of early conversations that kind of led us to playing. It's interesting, Mike, you talked about that whole process, from just those conversations, and that's really exactly what happened to us, was that just conversations. What can you do here? Can you give me a bit of advice? Can you connect me to a couple of your staff so I can ask them some questions? We began to talk a little bit about maybe we should just set up a fee for service model, because we were providing lots of supports, thinking about it, but had no formal agreement. So kind of went from a bit of discussion to a bit of advice to a formal fee for service model. And then we played with that for a while, and they asked us if we would consider kind of merging, and we said no. We didn't, feel like, I just had no, just didn't really have a vision of how we could do this, outside of, we've just played in Calgary and we feel safe here, and that seems too big and too much, and how would we ever merge? And so they bugged us for about a year as we kind of did our fee for service work, and we began to see, we're putting a lot of time in here, and maybe there are some good reasons to merge. And so those began to kind of become clearer. But what I would say, this really worked because of their CEO's just ability to, I think, see the future and play out some of the trends and I definitely didn't have that ability. And so it was really nice to work with somebody who said, let's take a chance and let's do this, and we can. And so we kind of caved after a while, and they bought us good swag. They got us nice mugs and things. And so, yeah, it was really unfair. Like, how can you turn down nice mugs? So we ended up agreeing to think about this process of actually, and we weren't sure at the time what it was going to be. Was it going to be a merger? Was it going to be an acquisition? Was it going to be, we didn't know. And those are the things that kind of came out in the process a little bit after that. But yeah, I would really give this to CARE's old CEO, just that ability to see ahead and make some brave decisions for their own organization. Yeah.
Yeah, an interesting thing. I mean, both organizations were strong within their own regions. And, obviously there was some gaps in service just because of the lack of support services up in the North region. But this one was geographically across, right? So now you're becoming across the entire province, basically, which is, different, has some different uniqueness than if you're merging within the same region, perhaps, or the ssame city. So we're going to come back to that geographical thing. The other thing I just wanted to mention, though, is CARE's legal structure. So they are if I have this right, a not-for-profit corp.
That's right. Yeah.
So they're not a society. So they have board members who are shareholders.
That's right.
And so that created some interesting nuances along the way as well. And hence, as Mike was saying in the beginning, the importance of getting some good legal advice as you're going through this. So here you are, you've got two agencies that are both providing good quality service in different regions, but recognizing the need to enhance their services, I guess. So it really started focusing on services. And so you went through a structured due diligence process, as Mike had mentioned, where you look at the finances, and we went through, I think, like phase one, where it was a fairly high level just to decide, is this even worth considering to go into a more in-depth exploration. But through that due diligence process, finances, HR, governance, marketing, brand, all those kinds of things. And tell us a little bit about, how did you find that process? What did you learn from it? How did it kind of prepare you to go forward?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole bunch of pieces in there. The one thing I would say, which was really helpful, was to have some outside folks. So working with IntegralOrg, you, Leslie, and Mike, and to really begin to figure out what are the groups, what is it, HR and governance, and what are the specific groups that need to do their work. And so that kind of really purposeful diligence took place. But in that, you really do appreciate that history in many ways creates who you are. And so everything is crossed over and everything is way messier, Mike, back to that quote you had, than you think. So you think, oh yeah, you have your HR team and your HR processes. Well, they're messed up because our HR director has been here for 30 years. So she's really tied into programming. So half the time she's doing other things over on this side, and somebody's doing something over here, and our HR does not look like their HR. And so it really has been trying to separate why we are what we are, which is partly historical, partly government relations, partly the way our funding has come, and try to then compare apples to apples, because it's really difficult. So you'd think in two organizations who have pretty similar service models and have been around for a similar amount of time, like we didn't use one piece of software that was the same. So if they use this, we use that. It was like, oh my God, really? Like, could we not have one thing? So it's actually been kind of interesting to see how they, through their history and in their region and the way they kind of ran their business, and us doing this, we've ended up in really different places. And so the due diligence is really important. It's critical to stay kind of committed to trying to do that. But the messiness of it and some of the things we thought, oh, this will be easy, our HR systems have got to look like theirs. They don't look anything like theirs. Our payroll, completely different payroll systems, everything. So that's been a bit, that's been a lot of learning for sure. I think the thing that's been interesting though, and kind of back to, we started with this, they're asking us to come and, so, we puffed our chests up and thought we were pretty special. And, but I think what we learned in the due diligence piece for sure is that it is it's become much more of a shared process together, because I think our services probably had a little more sophistication, our service delivery, only because of the resources here and the chance to learn. And we've been doing it for a little bit longer. But in many ways, some of their systems were so much stronger than ours, some of their payroll and some of their administrative systems. And we kind of learned, we've been thinking about why that is. And we've sort of been an organization that it's kind of just slowly grown and kind of bumped along. And, we'll add a little piece of, we'll add some kind of Excel spreadsheet to help us with payroll, but we won't change our payroll system or whatever. And they actually in their process had a few more kind of big moments. They had one, I won't go into details, but 5 or 6 years ago had to really rethink a lot of their kind of payroll and finance and some of their HR systems. And so because they had an outside auditor come in and look at some of that stuff for them. So they have actually, in many ways, in the last 5 or 6 years, done a lot of significant changes to improve their systems, where we just kind of added little fixes on. So, our systems are covered a lot by duct tape, and they actually had really good, clean systems. So it's been interesting that way. Your history's put you to a place where you are today. But you don't recognize that until you're having to play with somebody else and compare yourself. So their CEO said this, a few months into the process, which I totally agree. And she said, every agency should be forced to do this, whether you merge or not. Like, you should be forced to look at all of your systems and compare yourself to a sister organization and just to learn. And I think, that is actually so true, because even if we didn't go through this merger, we would be way better off with kind of just the learning we've done from them, and learned how they got to where they are, and learned how we got to be where we are. And neither is good or bad. It's just that history. So that's been actually really interesting. That's been a big piece of the learning for us. A lot of the pain, but a lot of the good stuff too.
Yeah. And as a witness, to the process, I certainly appreciate that, as you may have entered the process going in thinking, kind of you've been asked to help out or whatever, but your ability to put away the ego and say, what we have to look at ourselves too. This is not a one-sided assessment. This is everybody examining everything, and everybody's skeletons come out, and you have to really be open to being curious and being willing to look at changing your own way of doing business, your own systems, your own processes for the better long term. And we had the benefit of watching your organization
Years
work
and you
through
watch
that.
me. Yeah, that's right. Curled up in a corner. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, well, I mean, that has been challenging because it was them that approached us, and again, kind of us feeling good about ourselves, and then kind of looking in the mirror and thinking, oh, we don't maybe do that quite as well as them. And our choice would be to push back and to say, well, we're going to do it our way anyway. And so it took a while. It took some internal, probably in some ways, some fights. People, you'll learn, I think, if any other agencies are going to go through this, different people hold on to different things in ways you wouldn't expect. And so some of our folks held so dearly on to, certain systems that we use, even when it's quite clear that they're not the best system to use, or, held on to some notions that we're really good here when maybe we're really not, right? Because some of that becomes, I think, for me, some of it was personal, which is, I've been in this leadership position for a while. And so it's pretty comfortable for me. I kind of probably know what I'm okay at and know what I'm bad at. But you get a whole new list of things that you're bad at when you're trying to work with another organization. You think, wow, I really should be better at that, or I should know that, and I don't. Or so it's been, the personal challenges for some of us on, I think, our side, and me for sure, around what I can do or can't do. This whole software thing as an older person is like, oh my God, I've just got to. So it is starting to just defer and say, you know what, I just have a few years left here. I don't want to get in the way of progress. I'm really excited about this process. So just be gentle with me. Grant me some grace as I learn Monday.com and all this other stuff. But, hopefully, and then trying to find what I am going to bring to the process. Because it's not, just the messiness of combining systems, etc. There's some messiness in all of us finding our new roles in a new organization. And we had our roles pretty clear. I've been at Scope, since electricity was invented. And so, it's a bit challenging to think, well, what value do I bring to an organization with a lot of young, smart people, right? And I haven't figured that out yet, but I'm going to hang on for dear life for a while, because
But you're really talking about the opportunity to bring the best of both together, and that is where that 1 + 1 is better than 2, right? It's bigger than the both of you, because you have, if you're open to it, the opportunity to really pick the best of the best. So just kind of talking about some of the challenges you've faced, and maybe we could start with culture. I mean, culture is something that can really be a huge barrier and can actually completely destroy any attempts at strategic alliances. And on paper, people's often their mission, vision, values look very similar. How did that kind of unroll for you in reality?
Well, it was interesting because I know you and Mike helped lead us through lots of those kind of vision, mission, North Star. You know, we all have the same commitment to the same fruit. And I really believe that. And I think that made the merger a little bit, you know, this process a little bit easier. But culture is, I mean, the tricky thing about culture is it's hard to see. So you have to kind of dig down to figure it out. And so things like leadership, like how are decisions made in an organization and who gets to make them? And, you know, things like, you know, one of the things I was laughing about is this idea of, you know, how much tolerance do you have for, you know, that old saying, you know, ask or, you know, permission versus forgiveness, right? Do you just go ahead and do stuff and ask for forgiveness later? Or is there tolerance for that? And both organizations have a very different tolerance for that. Like one organization is much more the kind of due diligence and then we'll make a decision. And one is a little bit more like, yeah, let's try it and then we'll figure it out, right? And not even in, you know, different departments are like that. So I think some of you almost have to go through to begin to identify what the culture is. But I would say that, you know, we've had a few bumps in the culture piece around some of that decision making stuff, around how we spend money. So I'll give you an example. Like we had a long time well, we thought it was a great philosophy in the disability field for a long time. And Leslie, you were here when this was going on. Organizations felt like, and we believe this, that we shouldn't own property, because if we own property that clients live in, then they don't have that ability to move services if they're service, because this is your home. So now you're always stuck with scope because you live in a scope home. So for the longest time, we never purchased any property. We didn't have, but of course that was, and care, on the other hand, had a really different philosophy and different way of, you know, different culture around, let's purchase as much as we can. Let's really create a really big, organization that has a lot of stuff attached to it. So now that our philosophy caught up to us in a really negative way, you know, 10 or 15 years ago, when people couldn't even afford to live like on AISH, and we were having so many problems with folks in rental units, especially because of the behavioral concerns they had, we ended up having to start purchase property, but we were 20 years behind, you know. And so our philosophy and that culture of us, you know, being real ideologues, and we're going to believe this, even if it didn't make sense, we believed it way too long, and it caught up to us. So they now are an organization with way more, they're half our size and double the amount of assets they have, and they use them really well in that ability to provide service to, you know, more complex folks. We're on the catch up on that. So, you know, it's kind of been interesting, that philosophy and culture piece, I think, go a bit together. And probably now I feel like we're much more like them. I wish we had had that same kind of thinking 20 years ago, but we didn't, because we are completely committed to this sort of social justice mission of never owning anything. And, you know, it hasn't helped. So, yeah, so I think that's kind of an example. But yeah, well, what is this saying that you always say, culture eats something for breakfast? What do you say, Leslie?
Culture eats strategy for breakfast. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
So, but I, you know, and I don't know, Mike probably has lots to say about this too, but I do think culture is hard to exactly figure out. And so you almost need to kind of play with it a bit, but be really aware of it. And so we have had lots of conversations around, you know, when, excuse me, when we see a difference, or we see, why would you make that decision? And why do we make this decision? We try to dig down and look at it. Is it a cultural piece? Like, is it a belief piece, or is it just a pragmatic piece, or what is it? The other thing that's interesting, sorry, I'm talking a lot. I guess that's okay.
Okay, this is good.
Talk a lot, but our staff group are here a lot longer. So we have a really lots of folks that, you know, we tease one of our directors who's been here 18 years that he's still the new guy on the block. So we don't get a lot of turnover, which is awesome, and they've had more turnover. So, you know, culture is partly they're, I think, able to understand or reflect on their culture a bit more because they're newer into it, and they're in many ways still creating it. We've been in this creation of our culture for 30 years, which I think makes it harder I don't know why we've done that. We've done that for 25 years, right? So it is that digging back and trying to remember, which has been really, in some ways, quite fun in this process because we wouldn't have been forced to have to do it otherwise. So I feel like we've gone back and learned a lot about why we do what we do, and until you understand that, it's hard to make different decisions about it.
Right.
So we're starting to make different decisions.
And then with the geographical differences, I guess it's also really figuring out, is this a difference in the culture that needs to be addressed, or is this something that exists because geographically things are just we're in two different worlds and it's okay to be different? And which needs to be addressed and which is okay to be different just because of the location difference, right? Because things are different, rural versus Calgary.
Yeah, they really are. And different regions have had different funding models. So all of that really, in some ways, I think we're thinking about that as it could be a negative or positive. We're trying to turn that into a positive, which is, what are the areas that those are just yours, and you should continue to do those the way you do them, and we'll continue to do those in the South. We've made this decision that we don't have a head office. We have a North and South offices. So we're not trying to, one, make the decisions for the other, but really, the North office needs the autonomy to decide that makes sense for us in the North. The South office needs the autonomy to decide this makes sense for us in the South. And then what are the areas that, we really have to do together? Lots of those, I think, are around standards and best practices, like trying to elevate and bring to attention. You talk about this North Star idea, but trying to always remember, like, we're in this to provide the best services we can. And part of those are meeting the standards that we've all, that are connected to our contracts. But I think more than that, trying to elevate the conversations to say, what do we really imagine for not only our clients, but for our staff and for our new organization? What is the community that we want to create here? And so we start talking about it as a community, and really that we add ourselves into that. So everybody that's attached, hopefully, to this community benefits, no matter who you are in it, right? Is the kind of conversations we're trying to have. But yeah.
So one of the factors that always comes into play is around communication, right? And when you communicate, when you bring people in, I mean, it has to start pretty small when you're first having these initial conversations, because you don't want people to start hearing all kinds of rumors and you have no idea whether things are going to go forward or not. But maybe just tell us a little bit about how the communication was managed. When did you start to bring in other people, the staff, the families, the funders?
Yeah. This would be just one of those other areas that I probably kind of is over my head. We are really fortunate because CARE, I think Glory's on the call, so I'll just say hi to Glory, but CARE had a professional communications person attached to them. And so it was so great to get that advice and have somebody that is not doing communication off the side of their desk. The communication here at Scope was often, especially around policy changes or big things, as that I would write. I'm writing letters, which of course nobody's ever going to read. And, that's how we've communicated generally, where they actually have really much more sophistication around there from newsletters. And so that's been really helpful. But around that containment, I mean, that's an interesting kind of process, because people want different things. So, they say you can't over communicate. And I would say that's true, because, one person wants to know we're merging because of the big picture, because, that's what they're interested in. And one person wants to know that what their job is going to look like and another person wants to know both of those things, and guardians want something. And, so I think you can't under communicate, but the timing is a critical piece. And this is where, again, I appreciate the help of you and Mike and others. Like, when do you because the reality is, probably from the moment that Rilla and I started talking, other people started to know something was going on. And then the first time that we went up to Grand Prairie to, begin to do some work, or the first time folks from Grand Prairie came down to look at some of our models, like, things are happening, and frontline staff know, and they kind of wonder. So I'm not sure we did it quick enough. We probably didn't. But we tried to kind of keep those concentric circles. It's first the leadership and the board, and then it's who else is going to know, and then it's that kind of stuff. So a brand. I see a note around the branding. I don't know if you want to talk about that now, or we can talk about it. But yeah, so I mean, branding is one of those things, and Of course, communication is hopefully somewhat back and forth. And so, one of the things we start to brand Glory, again, really great at this, start to imagine what our new brand would look like and what our name would look like and who's going to get to be involved in that. If you involve them, then you have to respect their decision, but there might be some bad decisions made. And so, and these goofy things, there's a reason my partner won't let me pick colors for our house. So then I'm in this process of trying to, pick colors for the new organization. So, some stuff you just got to let others that have the ability, do that. But so Glory brought us all of this stuff. Originally, Glory wanted us to be called the Alberta Scope Society, but the acronym just didn't work. So we became, as you can get that. So yeah, so those kinds of things were, some of that was actually fun, and some of it was, but trying to decide who should be involved and trying to keep people engaged and interested and not be too directive. I think one of the things that we've appreciated about our own organization is we've tried to have somewhat of a shared democratic leadership process. It fits with the people here that are in leadership positions. So, sometimes it felt like, geez, we're making so many decisions and not including others. But we tried to just pick those moments that made sense. And there's the moments when, let everybody take a look at the logo and have a say on it, because that's not really so yeah. So communication, sorry, blah, blah, blah. Anything, what do you think, Leslie, when you saw how we tried to communicate? What would you say about it? Or is there any other questions?
Well, I mean, we tried to be very intentional, right? And always every time we met, we had a conversation about, who do we need to talk about, tell what we've just talked about, and, who needs to know. But, I think the challenge is, until there's been a kind of formal decision, even to just move forward into maybe phase 2 of a more in-depth exploration, it's hard to know if it's the right decision to not communicate it out. But there, there's the fear factor of people being very unsettled for a length of time when things may or may not happen. I mean, once the board has made the decision that they're going to seriously look at this, then you probably can't get it out fast enough, right? Because it's going to get out there. The circle just starts to get bigger and bigger, and you lose control over it. You much rather be in front of it, obviously. But
yeah,
at the end of the day, by the time you had the town halls, I mean, everybody kind of knew what was going on anyways, didn't they?
Yeah, they really did. The challenge with the town halls, though, because it was that big level, here's what we're going to do, and we promise everybody has a job and everything's going to be rosy and beautiful, which is sort of, I think, what you have to start to tell people. But really, some people did have real fears, because we did have 2 of these positions, 1 in each agency, and we had 2 of these positions. And on the front line, as anybody knows, in disability services, we have lots of work, so nobody's going to lose. Nobody's going to lose their job. There's no redundancies on the front line. But was there some redundancies in some of the positions that we had? And there realistically was. Now, some of that became luck, because a couple of people in the organizations decided that they were moving on, or it was time for them. One of our director of finance retired, which is awesome, because we had 2 directors of finance. So how are we going to figure that out, right? And so there's a couple of moments in time that we just got lucky on a little bit. But there is I would say still there is a bit of a level of fear, because we're still a few months away from officially becoming one organization. What does it look like? So there's tons of communication right now. There's tons of working through job descriptions. There is, and I think we'll talk a bit about trust in a bit, but it really comes down to, are you building a bit of goodwill with one another, that if you say, so we as sort of they're merging in, so this is a merger. So we are 2 entities becoming one entity, and we're staying as scope, right? And so they merged into us. So the promise has been, there's work for everybody, but it doesn't mean that your jobs might not change a little bit. So what does that mean? And who gets to say that? And who gets to decide what my job changed into? And the power structure, which is what we're kind of trying to sort out. And they had a different way of of making decisions and power, and it was probably a little more linear, and ours is a little messier. And so, I know there's been a couple of people like, well, tell me exactly what my job is. And well, we can't, because we're not there yet.
Yeah.
But they want to know, and I get that. It's easier to be a person like I'm in this organization in a position of power.
Yeah.
So it's easier for me to say, oh, relax and deep breaths, when somebody else is making your job description for you.
Yeah.
That's challenging, right? And so I think we're trying to be more sensitive to that. I think if I look back even over the last 6 months, a bit more communication over that and a bit more sensitivity for myself for sure would have been helpful on that for a few folks that have had to really just go back to, and I've had to have, and so have others, just those one-to-one conversations, sometimes more than once, around what is your place here, let's figure it out, and there is a place for you, and so doing that.
There's a significant time difference between when the board says, yes, we want to go forward with implementing a merger, and when the merger is actually done. I mean, you're looking at probably 1 year to 2 years of detail, right? And sorting it all through. And that is just the messy middle. And it's very difficult to shorten that a lot because, well, capacity, I mean, there's just some things that take time. You have to go through a whole fiscal year with an agency if they're winding it down with no assets and no liabilities. I mean, there's just some processes that have to be followed that just take time, and there's just no circumventing some of that. And so, you can do some of it quickly, but there's just some of it you can't. And so it does take, I think, a lot longer than people even know, because you're still not done, right? I mean, we've been at this for quite a while. You're far along, but there's still stuff to be sorted, right? You don't have the answers for everybody yet.
Yeah, Mike had hair when we started this, and look at now. So, yeah, no, you're right, and you can't speed some of that up. So I think it's just trying to be respectful of everybody's feelings in that, and appreciate that some of us in different positions, it's a little easier than others. But yeah, it does take. Well, and the other thing I would just say around nonprofits, so anyone, this is our group that we're talking to, is most of us, or maybe you're luckier than us, but it's not like we had a ton of money on the side to go through this, right? So, we, hired you guys for $10 an hour at IntegralOrg to, do this work with us. But really, it's on all of our desks now, and so I still have my job. And I have this, and everybody else that's involved in this, especially on both sides of the leadership table, are doing this on top of all the things we would regularly be doing. So it is a lot of work, and I would definitely not warn people, but just be prepared for that. And so the good advice and the process stuff that somebody like yourselves can provide is completely helpful, but it won't take away the amount of work, the number of conversations you have, the number of times you're sitting at home at night thinking, oh, like, how do I talk to this person about that? Those things are just there, and they are multiplied when you're going through this. So again, exciting and fun, but it's a lot of, it is some extra stuff. Yeah,
absolutely. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about, I mean, you're still in process, but you've done some nice things, I think, to celebrate the past and to acknowledge people's work, and also to kind of close off. I mean, there's a point where that ship has sailed, right? We're not going back to how it was. This is the new us. How do we acknowledge that? How do we celebrate that? And yet both agencies have such history.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate the graciousness of them, of kind of giving up their name and moving to what's closer to our name, and but I think a couple of good conversations have happened. A couple of decisions, like it's not a head office and a side where there's north and south office, like trying to tamp down a little bit of the us and them, and it is us. I think a few little wins help, So we've had a few wins, I think, around some of the client stuff where we've seen some good client outcomes already, and that's beginning. And so everybody can get on board when that begins to happen.
Right.
And I think on the administrative side at Scope, kind of seeing once we were able to accept that, oh, there are better ways of doing some stuff, then there are better ways, and then people get excited about seeing those better ways. So a few of those wins, I think, have really helped. And then, I think we are appreciative of their organization. Kind of, it was a family founder kind of situation where the founder was around for 40 years. His daughter became the CEO after working in the organization. So, you have to appreciate and celebrate that they're giving up a lot. And so, we've been really trying to give lots back and acknowledge that. And I know we're doing some stuff specifically around the founder, and we'll have some celebrations when that happens, when we're kind of officially emerged. But we've all the way along, I hope we've done this. Gloria, you can pipe in and tell us if we have, but, tried to be appreciative that this is challenging, and maybe more of the challenges on their side, especially around the feelings of loss and maybe feelings of, we're giving something up in our community. Our board was smart. We opened up some board positions for some folks in Grand Prairie on our board. So we've tried to think about it, from all parts of the organization. Where are the opportunities to merge? Where are the opportunities to say we're one versus us and them? And so that's been a lot of the conversation. And I think to call it out if you see it, like, oh, we don't do things like that, and you guys do things like that. Like, why? And try to make sense of it, and then kind of have a chuckle about, one of us was goofy around why we did that, and then move on to the better process. So, and give people some recognition in that, because there's bright folks on both sides that really want the best here, but our egos occasionally get in the way, and our feelings get in the way, and our, so.
But as you said, the focus has always been on how do we provide the best quality service to individuals with complex needs and across Alberta. And so, that has to, in the tough times, going back.
Yeah, you bring that back. You're right. I feel like that. I mean, it's easy to say that, but I feel like we have worked towards that. Like I feel both organizations have been kind of mission-driven organizations. Our missions are pretty important to us, and so, yeah.
So I know there's been some great questions coming in, and I want to make sure that we have a chance to get them. So thank you, Ryan, for sharing that. We're going to come back to you for sure, but we want to give a chance for people to put some questions forward. So I think we're going to turn it back over to Mike, and he can.
Yeah. And also, I got a couple that's popped up. I want to, I think you undersell your marketing ability, Ryan. I believe you're the one who suggested combining Scope and Care into the name Scare as a new organization.
Scare was mine, I will admit that.
Which is perhaps why you have Glory now doing that work for you. A couple questions came up, Ryan. If you can highlight Ryan to here, perhaps Sandeep too. The idea that, you mentioned a bit about redundancies. And one of the things you didn't mention in your entire speech was wonderful. I love your transparency. You didn't talk about efficiencies at all. You didn't talk about you're doing this because there was a way to save money or do anything else. But the idea, it's kind of a myth that's out there sometimes in terms of mergers. It's just a cheaper way of doing things. Is that at all true, do you think? Are there efficiencies that you can find on the financial side to start with, but perhaps in other ways too? Yeah.
I think on the frontline service side, there really aren't any efficiencies other than the efficiencies that both organizations continually try to find based on, smaller and smaller contracts and etc. But no, I don't think so, Mike, because, you could say that if you took two organizations that both felt like they were working pretty much full out, I don't know where you find efficiencies, because now you've created a more complex system, right? And so I think there is place for everyone. And I think actually, especially during that probably year, you might find some a little later, but I think in that first year of really trying to do your own job and at the same time imagine what this new organization might look like, and then combining those things, I think efficiency is really hard to find. I would say that people are working more than they have for a long time. And they have for the last 6 or 8 months, and they will continue to for probably another 6 or 8 months. Maybe when we get to a place where we're kind of a little more settled and we really understand and have felt like we've got to that service model where our clients really are receiving the best services they can and our outcomes continue to improve, we might find a few efficiencies, but they're few and far between. That, I mean, maybe that's just us and maybe that's our inability to see more, but I don't think there's a lot in the worlds of nonprofits because we're pretty lean, right? I feel like we're all pretty lean. So yeah. What's your experience been around that, like with others, other groups?
I think 1 to 2% at most, perhaps. Hard to say.
Yeah,
It is. I
yeah,
think it answers the question in the chat about how you could guarantee people's jobs. Well, there's not a lot of change that way, and you even look at both organizations, which we have, or even look at Ryan. He's running a $50 million nonprofit and working in some sort of storage locker or something like that. So you can sort of see the background here, that there just wasn't a lot there left. So I think it is really clear that way. Another
mm-hmm.
question that popped up is, and this is talk about when you sort of open up the concentric rings of service, when do you start to bring in government? You know, both organizations very heavily dependent on PDD, but also some other governance departments. But when do you start, how are those conversations and when? I know they're still in process, but when do you bring those folks into the mix? It's kind of an important stakeholder here.
Yeah, it really is. I think after the kind of leadership and the boards decided that we're serious about this and going to go forward, and I think one of the things, Mike, that was really helpful is we built in lots of off ramps along the way, right? But one of the off ramps was if government says no, we're not gonna, support this, and that's an off ramp that we're not gonna have any choice about, and we'll either go back to a fee for service model or whatever. So we brought them in fairly early because we saw that as one of one of the possible barriers, but also then one of the positives. So pretty early in, after we felt like we could do it, felt like both organizations, some of the due diligence around finances, etc., were there and done, and the boxes were checked for the boards. Then we felt like let's talk to government right away. So we did that. Both the leadership of both organizations met with our executive team from both regions. We're in a two-region area, and then also the assistant deputy minister, and just kind of got a stamp of approval from them that this made sense. We did, again, with Glory's help, did some nice press releases that we sent out at the same time. So in conjunction with talking to government, right after our meeting with government, the next day we sent out some press releases. So we were kind of all prepared to kind of go forward if it sounded like things were good. So yeah, I think governments are really critical. That's a really good question, because depending on the relationship you have and how you play with government, they may or may not support that. And that you might still decide to go forward, but probably in our case, we probably wouldn't have, because I think both organizations were sustainable and strong enough without each other. So we would have figured out some other ways to continue to work together around the client stuff, but not worry about this official merger.
Thank you. And sort of bring us to a close here. There's lots of, I think these are conversations. Well, I mean, I just could listen to you all day, Ryan. I think your honesty and your transparency, that's refreshing, and not just in terms of this process, but to have people in leadership of an organization that are so aware and open to them changes in themselves and others is quite a gift for us. I'm going to ask Leslie and Ryan, and I'll throw one here too, just your final thoughts, words of advice, maybe going down this path, and that not just about the merger, the wide range of options, but maybe I'll start with Leslie first here, and then they'll go to Ryan, then I'll figure what's left. Just a word of advice to folks who are starting to consider this kind of work.
I would say, one thing I was incredibly impressed about through the process is the culture of curiosity and the leadership that's required to foster that, and the importance of being open to change on all fronts, with all parties. And that, I think, applies, obviously if you're going into corporate integration, but when you're looking at even formal alliances, you have to be willing to set aside some of how you've done things in the past and look to a different way. And we just saw evidence of that over and over again. And I think that was such a significant contributor to the success of this merger is just that attitude and approach. And I know, Ryan, you had to chat with a couple of your staff on occasion to just bring them back to, this is not a takeover. This is us learning together to create a different future. And I think just having that attitude was absolutely critical. So.
Wonderful. Ryan, your thoughts on what you'd leave folks with as a word of advice?
Well, probably two. I think, and I can't understate this, the help that you guys provided, just that kind of oversight and direction piece is really, because most of us have never gone through this. So that's a big piece. But the other one, I love that saying, I'm sure lots of you know it, but change happens at the speed of trust. And I think that's just a big one. I think really understand that for people to feel good about this, like we have to kind of trust each other as we're moving forward, trust that the clients are going to get better services, trust that a provincial organization is going to make more sense in the future, those kinds of pieces. So take your time and build some of that trust stuff. And then I think the change pieces are going to be simpler. And that's easy to say. And I've made some bumbles along the way, but I think just trying to go back and say, oh yeah, where I missed it is that I need to talk to that person again, and we need to build a better understanding together. And then when you do that, it seems to solve itself really often. So,
cool. I think mine would be, if you want to do this, just buy somebody a fancy mug and they get on board. That seems to be what I took away from most of what you said. So there it is. Yeah, $30 mug with a brand on it. It makes the rest easy. I think it is, a kind of summation of both your points, is that there is a process here, and that process can take you a lot of directions, and it doesn't matter what process you use, but you got to stick to it in some ways, because there is strategic options, there are very human options, there are elements of this thing too. You're dealing with people's lives and legacies, you're dealing with clients. There's the pure kind of technical things on contracts and legal liability. There's the government side. So how do you sort of hold all those things together? And that's a challenging job, but so you don't sort of start with the end. You got to hold the end as a North Star, but you got to sort of find a way, the route mapping kind of way through that. So take that seriously, and to take that seriously is an intentional activity. Thank you, folks. Thank you, Ryan, especially. And Ryan, Leslie, wonderful to see you too in this stuff. You're well done. I think that, Ryan, your honesty, your transparency, that the idea of looking honest at yourself and your organization so that those you serve is better is quite a gift. Just a little bit about us before Sandeep wraps it up. This is what we do in IntegralOrg. This is a part of our work, but we do strategy work. We are a legal service provider, so we do lots of work that way. We mentioned it, we do lots of governance stuff. All kinds of pieces. If you want to sort of thought about how we can help, we're here to talk. Our job is to help you do your work better. And that is a gift and a privilege every day. So it starts with a conversation with us. Love to have those conversations with you if you so choose. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Sandeep just to finish this off for today.
All right. Thank you, Mike, Ryan, Leslie. That was a wonderful and very insightful conversation. I've just popped the references for today's session on the screen now. Folks will get a copy of these slides and a video after the session, so they are there for you if you would like to dive deeper into any of these sources. And with that, thank you so much for joining us today for Beyond Collaborations. We hope that the session was informative and relevant to your nonprofit's needs and interests. If you could let us know your thoughts by completing a quick evaluation survey, that would be greatly appreciated. I'm dropping a link to that in the chat for you here now. All right. Well, thanks again for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, folks.